ballroom at the Waldorf Astoria was dead silent, save for the hum of $1 million air conditioning system. 40 of the world's most distinguished linguists, professors from Oxford to Yale, sat sweating in their bespoke suits, staring at a single sentence projected on the screen. They had all failed. Sheikh Zain, a man whose net worth rivaled the GDP of small countries, stood at the front, his eyes cold with disappointment. He was about to storm out, taking his billion-dollar contract with him, when a glass shattered near the back. A young waitress, invisible to everyone moments before, whispered a correction that didn't just translate the words. It unlocked a 20-year-old secret that would put a target on her back before the night was over. Grace Bennett adjusted the collar of her stiff uniform, fighting the urge to rub her aching feet. It was 10:10 p.m., and the heavy velvet curtains of the Waldorf Astoria's grand ballroom shut out the lights of New York City. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the palpable stench of fear. Grace was 24, with hair the color of roasted coffee beans pulled back into a severe bun, and eyes that missed nothing. To the men in this room, she was furniture. She was a tray carrier, a water refiller, a nobody. That was fine by her. In her line of work, or rather, the line of work she was trying to leave behind, being invisible was a survival skill. She moved silently between the round tables, refilling crystal goblets with sparkling water. At the center of the room sat 40 men and 3 women. They were the elite, the Arabic experts. Professor Sterling from Cambridge was there, pompously adjusting his bow tie. Dr. Vance from the Pentagon's linguistic department was tapping a gold pen nervously against the table. They had all been flown in on private jets, promised a consultation fee of $50,000 just for showing up, with a $10 million bonus for the one who could solve the riddle. At the front of the room stood Sheikh Zain. He was intimidatingly handsome, wearing a sharp, charcoal-grey Tom Ford suit that cost more than Grace's entire college tuition. He didn't wear traditional robes. He was a modern tycoon, educated in London, ruthless in business. But tonight, he looked desperate. "Gentlemen," Zain's voice was deep, carrying a British accent with just the faintest edge of the Middle East. "You are wasting my time." Professor Sterling cleared his throat, standing up. "Your Highness, with all due respect, the dialect you are presenting is inconsistent. It appears to be a mix of pre-Islamic poetry and," he scoffed, "gibberish. It is grammatically impossible." Zain slammed his hand on the podium. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "It is not gibberish. It is the final entry in my father's journal. The entry that dictates where the deed to the Al-Hassan oil fields was hidden before the coup in the 90s. If I do not present that deed to the International Court by Friday, my family loses everything to the state." He pointed to the screen. A single sentence glowed there in elegant, flowing Arabic script, but the arrangement of the letters was jarring. "The hawk sleeps only where the river bleeds silver, and the brother of the moon eats the sun." "It's a metaphor," Dr. Vance argued, standing up. "River bleeds silver? It means mercury, or perhaps moonlight on water." "It's poetry, Sheikh Zain. It's not a map." "It is a location," Zain roared, his composure cracking. "My father was not a poet. He was a pragmatist. He left me a map to the vault, and you, the greatest minds in the West, cannot tell me where it is." Grace froze. She was standing behind Professor Sterling, holding a pitcher of ice water. She looked up at the screen, her heart hammered against her ribs. She knew that script. She didn't learn it in a classroom at Harvard. She learned it at a kitchen table in a dusty safe house in Beirut, sitting on the lap of a man she called Uncle Cyrus, a man who had been an interpreter for British intelligence before he was assassinated. It wasn't just Arabic. It was a cipher used by the Bedouin runners during the Cold War to pass messages across borders without the Soviets understanding. It was a dialect of thieves. "It's nonsense," Sterling declared, throwing his napkin on the table. "I am the leading authority on Arabian dialects. If I say it has no meaning, it has no meaning. Your father was likely senile when he wrote this." The room went deadly quiet. Insulting the Sheikh's late father was a mistake. Zayn's eyes narrowed. He signaled to his head of security, a massive man named Kane standing by the door. "Get them out, all of them. The jet leaves in an hour. Send them back empty-handed." "Now see here," Sterling sputtered. Grace knew she should stay quiet. She had debts. She had a sick grandmother in Queens. She needed this job. If she spoke up, she would be fired. Or worse, if she was right, she would be noticed. But the arrogance of Professor Sterling made her blood boil, and the look of utter defeat on Sheikh Zayn's face, a man who had everything losing the only thing that mattered, tugged at something in her chest. "He wasn't senile," Grace whispered. It was quiet, but in the tomb-like silence of the ballroom, it carried. Professor Sterling turned around, his face flushing red. "Excuse me. Did the help just speak?" Zayn looked up, his dark eyes locking onto Grace. "What did you say?" Grace tightened her grip on the water pitcher. It was too late to back down now. She stepped forward, the lights of the chandelier reflecting in her eyes. "I said your father wasn't senile," Grace said, her voice steadying. "And Professor Sterling is wrong. It's not a poetry, it's directions." "Directions?" Sterling laughed, a cruel, barking sound. "Did you hear that, gentlemen? The waitress thinks she's a cartographer. Stick to pouring water, dear." "Let her speak," Zayn commanded. He walked down the steps of the stage, closing the distance between them. He moved with the grace of a predator. He stopped 3 feet from her. He smelled of sandalwood and rain. "What do you see that 40 PhDs do not?" Grace took a breath. The phrase, "river bleeds silver," isn't a metaphor for mercury. In the dialect of the northern border tribes, silver is a slang term for salt. A river that bleeds salt. She looked Zayn in the eye. "He's talking about an estuary, where the river meets the sea. And brother of the moon." She glanced at Sterling with disdain. "It's not celestial. In the old smuggling codes, the moon was the code name for the west. The brother of the moon was the east. Eats the sun refers to the sunset." Grace turned back to the screen. "Your father didn't hide the deed in a vault, Sheikh Zayn. He hid it in the salt caves facing the sunset at the mouth of the Jordan River. Specifically, the cave where the shadow falls longest at dusk." Silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. Professor Sterling turned purple. "This is preposterous. Smuggling codes? Slang? This is an insult to the language." Zayn didn't look at the professor. He pulled a sleek black phone from his pocket and dialed a number. He put it on speaker. "Tariq," Zayn said into the phone. "Check the geological survey of the old properties. Are there salt caves near the estuary?" A crackly voice responded instantly. "Yes, sir. The Silver Caves. They were sealed off 20 years ago." Zayn's gaze snapped back to Grace. There was no anger in his eyes now. There was shock and something else. Intensity. "And the shadow?" Zayn asked the phone. "Sir, the local legends say the main cave aligns with the sunset only during the winter solstice." Zayn hung up the phone. He looked at Grace as if she were a diamond he had found in a pile of coal. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. "Just a waitress, sir," Grace said, clutching her tray. "No," Zayn said, stepping closer, invading her personal space. "Waitresses do not know Cold War smuggling ciphers. Who are you?" Before she could answer, Professor Sterling stood up, knocking his chair over. "This is a setup. She's clearly a plant. A corporate spy fed the information to humiliate us." "Get out," Zane said, not even looking at him. "But get out," Zane roared, his voice shaking the crystal glasses. Security swarmed the room. The experts were ushered out, grumbling and protesting, leaving Grace alone in the vast ballroom with the billionaire. Zane studied her. "You just saved my company," he said. "And you humiliated my enemies. That puts you in a very dangerous position, Miss Bennett," she said. "Grace Bennett." "Well, Miss Bennett," Zane said, a small, dangerous smile touching his lips. "I hope you didn't have plans for the rest of the night. Because you're coming with me." Grace took a step back, her survival instincts flaring. "I can't go anywhere with you. I have a shift to finish. I have a life." Zane laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "You think Professor Sterling is going to let this go? He's on the board of the Blackwood Foundation. They have interests in seeing my family fail. By the time he reaches the lobby, he will have made calls. If you walk out that service entrance alone, you won't make it to the subway." Grace felt a chill run down her spine. She knew the Blackwood Foundation. They were a legitimate think tank on paper, but in the circles her father used to run in, they were known as corporate hitmen. "I can take care of myself," Grace lied. "I don't doubt it," Zane said, glancing at her hands. "You hold that picture like a weapon, not a serving tool. But I'm offering you a job. A real one." "I have a job. You have a uniform," Zane corrected. "I need a translator. Someone who knows the codes. The cave is just the beginning. My father's journal has 7 more entries. If the first one was coded, the rest will be 2. I fly to Jordan in 2 hours. Come with me." "And if I say no?" "Then I walk away," Zane said simply, "and I leave you to deal with Sterling's cleanup crew." It wasn't a threat from him. It was a statement of fact. Grace looked at the grand doors. She thought of her grandmother, lying in that cramped apartment in Queens, needing medication they could barely afford. "How much?" Grace asked. Zane didn't blink. 500,000, cash, plus expenses. Grace's breath hitched. That would pay off the debts. It would get her grandmother into a private facility. It would buy her freedom. "I need 20 minutes to pack," she said. "You have 10, Zane replied, checking his watch. "My driver is out back. Don't go to your locker. Leave the uniform. I'll buy you new clothes." 20 minutes later, Grace was sitting in the back of a bulletproof Mercedes Maybach, speeding toward Teterboro Airport. She had changed into a spare blazer and slacks one of the female assistants had provided. Zane sat across from her, typing furiously on a tablet. He hadn't spoken a word since they got in the car. Grace watched the city blur by. "What have I done?" she thought. "I just jumped into the shark tank." The car phone buzzed. Zane answered. "Speak." He listened for a moment, his face hardening into a mask of fury. "When?" He listened again. "Who was it?" He hung up, his knuckles white. He looked at Grace, his eyes dark. "It seems you were right to worry," he said, his voice low. "My security team just found your locker at the hotel." "What happened?" Grace asked, her stomach dropping. "It was tossed, and there was a man waiting by the employee exit with a suppressed pistol. My team neutralized him. But he wasn't alone." Grace went cold. "They moved that fast?" "The deed to the oil fields is worth $400 billion, Zane said grimly. "People have started wars for less. Welcome to my world, Grace." The car swerved suddenly, tires screeching. "Hold on!" the driver shouted. A black SUV slammed into the side of the Maybach, shattering the reinforced glass on Grace's side into a spiderweb of cracks. The car spun, metal screaming against asphalt. Grace didn't scream. While Zane was thrown against the door, Grace braced her legs against the seat in front of her, grabbing the handle. As the car came to a violent halt, she saw men in ski masks pouring out of the SUV. "Doors locked!" Zane shouted, reaching for a weapon under his seat. "No," Grace said, her eyes scanning the tactical positioning of the attackers. "They have thermal charges. They'll blow the doors. We have to move." She looked at the billionaire. "Do you trust me?" "I don't even know you," Zane yelled as a bullet impacted the window right next to his head. "Good point," Grace said. She kicked the door open before the attackers expected it, using the heavy armored door as a shield. She didn't have a gun, but she grabbed the pen from Zane's pocket, a heavy, tactical steel pen. "Stay low," she ordered the Billionaire Sheikh. Grace Bennett, the waitress from the Waldorf, stepped out into the rain. The first attacker lunged at her. She didn't panic. She moved with a fluidity that betrayed years of hidden training. She dodged his baton, drove the steel pen into a pressure point on his shoulder, and kicked his legs out from under him. She grabbed his fallen pistol, checked the chamber, and fired 2 warning shots at the feet of the second attacker. "Back off!" she screamed. The attackers froze. They expected a terrified businessman and a waitress. They didn't expect a woman who held a Glock 19 like she was born with it. Zane stared at her from the back seat of the crashed car, his mouth slightly open. Sirens wailed in the distance. The attackers scrambled back to their SUV and peeled away. Grace lowered the gun, her hands shaking slightly now that the adrenaline was fading. She turned to look at Zane. "You said you needed a translator," Grace said, wiping rain from her face. "Looks like you need a bodyguard, too." Zane looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. He didn't see a servant anymore. He saw a warrior. "Double the pay," Zane breathed. $1 million. Grace smirked, tossing the gun onto the seat next to him. "Deal. Now, let's get to that jet." The Gulfstream G650 was a palace in the sky, cream leather seats, gold fixtures, and a silence that felt heavy after the chaos on the highway. Grace was in the lavatory, washing grease and blood off her hands. She looked at herself in the mirror. Her bun had come undone, strands of dark hair framing a face that looked paler than usual. She touched the scar on her collarbone, hidden beneath her shirt. "Uncle Cyrus warned me," she thought. He said the past never stays buried. When she emerged, Zane was sitting at a mahogany table, 2 glasses of amber liquid in front of him. He had changed his ruined jacket for a black cashmere sweater. He looked less like a tycoon and more like a man carrying the weight of the world. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. Grace sat. She didn't touch the drink. "You're not just a waitress," Zane said. It wasn't a question. Waitresses don't know Krav Maga, and they don't know how to check the chamber of a firearm in under a second. "I had a complicated childhood," Grace said, deflecting. "Who was your father?" "A diplomat," Grace lied effortlessly. "We traveled a lot." "Liar," Zane said softly. He slid a folder across the table. Grace froze. It was a dossier, her dossier. "My head of intelligence is very efficient," Zane said. "Grace Bennett, born in Chicago. Mother died when you were 3. Father unknown. You were raised by your grandfather, Liam Bennett. But here is where it gets interesting." Zane tapped the paper. Liam Bennett wasn't just a grandfather. He was a cryptologist for the CIA in the 80s. He worked in the Middle East. He worked with my father. Grace stared at the file. She hadn't known that. She knew her grandfather was secretive, and she knew he taught her languages, but he never mentioned the al-Rashid family. "So," Zane leaned forward, his eyes intense. "It seems our fates have been intertwined long before tonight. Your grandfather created the codes my father used. I didn't know, Grace whispered. I swear. It doesn't matter, Zane said. What matters is that you are the only one who can read them, and clearly someone else knows who you are. Those men on the highway, they weren't trying to kidnap me, Grace. They were trying to kill you. Grace felt the blood drain from her face. Why? Because if you're dead, Zane said grimly, I can't find the deed. And if I can't find the deed, the Blackwood Foundation wins. They take the oil fields. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the clouds bathed in moonlight. We land in Ammon in 7 hours, Zane said. From there, we take a helicopter to the Salt Caves. But I need to warn you, Grace. The entry you decoded, it's not just a map. It's a warning. A warning about what? Zane turned back to her. My father didn't just hide a deed. He hid proof. Proof that the current government officials, the ones trying to seize my company, are the ones who assassinated him. The realization hit Grace like a physical blow. This wasn't just a business trip. This was a coup. If we open that cave, Grace said, we topple a government. Yes, Zane said, and they will send an army to stop us. He extended his hand to her. Last chance to back out, Grace. We can land in Paris. I can give you the money and a new identity. You can disappear. Grace looked at his hand. She thought of the adrenaline, the thrill she hadn't felt since she left Beirut. She thought of the boring, grey life of wiping tables and being invisible. She stood up and took his hand. His grip was warm and firm. I'm not running, Grace said. Let's go find your legacy. The helicopter, a matte black Sikorsky, cut through the dry heat of the Jordanian morning like a knife. Below them, the landscape was a sprawling tapestry of burnt orange and dusty beige, broken only by the jagged scars of wadis and the shimmering, deceptive heat haze. Grace sat strapped into the jump seat, wearing tactical cargo pants and a lightweight linen shirt Zane had procured for her in Paris during a refueling stop. She looked less like a waitress now, and more like the woman she had been hiding inside for 5 years. She adjusted the headset, her eyes scanning the horizon. We are approaching the estuary, the pilot announced. Thermal scans are clear, but I'm picking up some electromagnetic interference near the ridge. Zane looked at Grace. The billionaire looked tired. The stress of the last 24 hours was etching lines around his eyes that money couldn't smooth over. Interference? Jamming devices, Grace said, her voice flat over the comms. Someone doesn't want us calling for help once we land. Tariq said the area was secured, Zane frowned, tapping his knee nervously. Tariq is in London, Grace reminded him. We are on the ground. Trust your eyes, not the report. The helicopter touched down in a cloud of swirling sand. The Silver Caves were not a tourist destination. They were a geological anomaly, a cluster of salt formations near the Dead Sea that had been closed off due to instability decades ago. The entrance was a gaping maw in the side of a limestone cliff, encrusted with white salt crystals that glittered like diamonds, or teeth. They disembarked, the heat hitting them like a physical blow. Kane, the head of security who had survived the ambush in New York, took point with an assault rifle. 2 other guards flanked them. The journal, Zane said, handing Grace the leather-bound book. You said the entrance aligns with the sunset. It's 10:00 a.m. Grace opened the book. The pages were yellowed, filled with the elegant, cramped handwriting of the late Sheikh. She ignored the obvious text and looked for the patterns she had learned on her grandfather's knee. The sun is a metaphor for direction, not just time, Grace murmured, tracing the script. Look here. The brother of the moon eats the sun. In the dialect, eating can also mean eclipsing or covering. He's not talking about the time of day. He's talking about the shadow cast by that pillar. She pointed to a massive, stand-alone rock formation that looked vaguely like a hawk perching. If we follow the shadow line from the hawk rock, Grace explained, walking toward the cliff face, it points to a fissure 50 feet above the main cave entrance. That's the real way in. The main entrance is likely booby-trapped. Climbing? Zane looked up at the sheer rock face. I am a businessman, Grace, not a mountain goat. Then you better learn fast, Grace said, tightening her bootlaces. Because we're not alone. She had spotted it, a glint of metal on the ridge line 300 yards back. A scope. Sniper! Grace tackled Zane into the sand, just as a bullet cracked the air where his head had been a microsecond before. The sand exploded near Kane's boots. Contact rear! Contact rear! Kane roared, returning fire blindly toward the ridge. Go! Move to the rocks! Grace shouted, dragging the billionaire by his collar. They scrambled over the jagged terrain, bullets whining off the salt pillars around them. The interference the pilot had sensed was a setup. They had walked into a kill box. They reached the base of the hawk rock. It offered temporary cover. They have the high ground, Kane yelled over the gunfire. We can't stay here. We need to get inside that fissure. I can climb it and drop a rope, Grace said, assessing the climb. It was a 5.9 difficulty at best, doable for her, impossible for Zane without a rope. Too dangerous, Zane argued, wiping grit from his face. You'll be exposed. Stay here and die, or climb and live, Grace snapped. Give me the rope. Without waiting for permission, she grabbed the coil from Kane's pack. She moved with frantic precision, finding handholds in the salt-crusted rock. Her fingers bled, sliced by the sharp crystals, but she didn't stop. Pop, pop. Bullets chipped the rock inches from her hand. She didn't look down. She focused on the rhythm. Reach, pull, stabilize. Reach, pull, stabilize. She crested the ledge 50 feet up and rolled into the dark fissure. She immediately anchored the rope to a stalagmite and threw the end down. Climb! She screamed. Zane went first. He was stronger than he looked, fueled by adrenaline. He hauled himself up, his face pale. Kane followed, while the other two guards laid down suppressing fire. One guard took a hit to the leg, but managed to get clipped onto the rope and hauled up by Kane. The second guard wasn't so lucky. A heavy caliber round took him in the chest. He fell silent in the sand. Leave him! We have to go! Grace ordered, pulling Zane into the darkness of the cave. They retreated deep into the fissure, the sound of gunfire fading into a dull echo. They were inside, but now they were trapped in a labyrinth of salt, with a mercenary army waiting outside. Who are they? Zane demanded, his voice echoing in the cavern. Sterling? The Foundation? Sterling is a linguistics professor, Grace said, turning on her tactical light. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing walls that sparkled with millions of salt crystals. He doesn't hire sniper teams. This is private military. This is Blackwood. Alexander Blackwood. Zane spat the name. The CEO of the Foundation. He wants the oil fields for his energy conglomerate. He wants you dead, Grace corrected. The oil fields are just the bonus. She shone the light down the tunnel. It split into 3 paths. Which way? Zane asked, looking at her. He was completely out of his element. The arrogance of the ballroom was gone, replaced by a raw reliance on the woman he had tried to dismiss as a servant. Grace opened the journal again. My grandfather taught me a rhyme about the salt caves. Left is for the devil, right is for the sea, the center path is where the dead men be. So, right? Zane guessed. No, Grace said, pointing to the center path. Your father hid the deed. He wanted it protected by the dead men. The center path leads to the crypts. The Bedouin burial grounds. That's where he would go. It's considered holy ground, a curse to those who enter without respect. I hope the curse works on mercenaries, Kane grunted, reloading his weapon. Let's move, Grace said. And don't touch the walls. The salt is unstable. One vibration could bring the ceiling down. The air in the crypts was cool and smelled of ancient dust and mineral decay. They had been walking for an hour. The path twisted and turned, a natural maze amplified by the hallucinations caused by the salt-heavy air. Grace led them to a large, circular chamber. In the center stood a stone sarcophagus, far older than the Al-Rashid dynasty. But it wasn't the sarcophagus that caught Grace's eye. It was the modern, biometric lockbox resting sacrilegiously on top of it. There it is, Zane breathed. He rushed forward. Wait, Grace warned. Zane stopped. What? Look at the floor. Grace pointed her light. Surrounding the sarcophagus was a circle of fine grey powder. Pressure plates? Kane asked. No, magnesium powder, Grace said. And a striker. If you step on that, the friction ignites the magnesium. In a room full of salt dust, it's a thermobaric bomb. It will incinerate everything in here. Zane froze. How do we cross? We don't, Grace said. She looked at the journal. There's a counterweight mechanism. We have to disable the striker. She scanned the walls. Carved into the salt were 4 stone hawk heads, protruding at cardinal points. The hawk sleeps only where the river bleeds silver, Grace recited the first clue. We need to interact with the hawks, but which one? Zane looked at the heads. They were identical. Think, Grace, Zane urged. What did your grandfather tell you about the hawks? Grace closed her eyes, blocking out the fear, the darkness, and the exhaustion. She went back to the kitchen table in 1999. Grandpa Liam was smoking a pipe. Gracie, the Bedouin hawk hunts in the morning, but sleeps facing the west, watching the sun die. West? Grace opened her eyes. She pulled a compass from Kane's pack. She located the west-facing hawk. We have to pull this lever. If you're wrong, Kane said, his hand hovering over the trigger of his gun out of habit. We turn into toast. I'm not wrong, Grace said. She reached into the carved mouth of the stone hawk. She felt a cold iron lever. She pulled. A heavy clunk echoed through the chamber. The ring of magnesium powder dropped away into a recess in the floor. The trap was disarmed. Zane let out a breath he had been holding for minutes. He walked to the lockbox. It required a thumbprint and a voice code. He placed his thumb on the scanner. It beeped green. Voice authentication required, a robotic voice echoed. Zane looked at the journal. What is the phrase? Grace flipped to the last page. It was blank. There's nothing here, she whispered. Panic flared in her chest. There has to be, Zane yelled. Check the binding, check the cover. Grace ran her hands over the leather. Then she saw it. Not ink, but indentations. Tiny pinpricks in the leather. Braille? No. It's a constellation map, Grace realized. Orion, the hunter. The phrase, Zane pressed. The hunter does not bow, Grace translated the intent. In Arabic, Al-Sayyad la yarka. Zane leaned into the microphone. Al-Sayyad la yarka. Click, hiss. The box popped open. Inside lay a heavy envelope, sealed with red wax, and a flash drive. Zane grabbed the envelope. He ripped it open. The deed, he whispered, his voice trembling. And the original transfer orders signed by the Minister of Defense. This proves they stole the company. We got it, Kane said, cracking a rare smile. Good job, everyone, a voice echoed from the entrance of the chamber. Grace spun around, leveling her light. Standing there, flanked by 6 heavily armed men in black tactical gear, was Tariq, Zane's trusted advisor. Tariq? Zane lowered the papers, confusion warring with horror on his face. What are you doing here? How did you get in? "I followed the tracker in your watch, sir," Tariq said smoothly, stepping into the light. He held a pistol loosely at his side. "And I have been working with Mr. Blackwood for 3 years. Did you really think you could save the company? The era of the Al-Rashid family is over. It's time for modernization." "You traitor," Zayn growled, stepping forward. "Stay back," Tariq warned, raising the gun. "Hand over the deed, Zayn, and the girl. Mr. Blackwood is very impressed with her. He wants to know how a waitress knows his encryption codes." "Over my dead body," Kane snarled, raising his rifle. "That can be arranged," Tariq said. The mercenaries opened fire. It wasn't a battle, it was a massacre in a phone booth. Kane took 3 rounds to the chest immediately, collapsing backward. The other injured guard was cut down instantly. Grace reacted on instinct. She didn't shoot at the men, she shot at the ceiling, a massive stalactite, weakened by the earlier vibration warning, sheared off directly above Tariq's men. "Cover!" Tariq screamed. The salt rock crashed down, crushing 2 mercenaries and creating a wall of dust and debris between the groups. "Run!" Grace grabbed Zayn's arm. They sprinted toward a narrow fissure behind the sarcophagus. The dead men's exit she had noted on the map earlier. It was a chute sliding down into darkness. "Where does this go?" Zayn yelled. "Ideally the ocean," Grace yelled back. "Realistically, somewhere lower than here." They jumped. They didn't hit water. They hit a pile of ancient, dry bat guano and sand. They tumbled into a lower cavern, bruised and gasping. "Kane!" Zayn whispered, staring up at the chute. "He's gone. He bought us time," Grace said, though her heart was breaking. She checked her weapon. 3 rounds left. They were deep underground, but the air was fresher here. A draft. "There's an exit," Grace said. "Come on." They limped through the dark for 20 minutes until they saw moonlight. They emerged onto a small, rocky beach at the base of the cliffs, hidden from the main entrance above. The Dead Sea lapped quietly at the shore, but waiting for them on the water was not a rescue boat. It was a sleek, black speedboat with the Blackwood logo on the side. Floodlights blinded them. "End of the line, Miss Bennett," a voice boomed from the boat's loudspeaker. They were surrounded. Men emerged from the rocks behind them. Tariq had anticipated the exit. Zayn tried to stand in front of Grace. "Let her go. You have me." 2 men grabbed Zayn, forcing him to his knees. Another grabbed Grace, twisting her arm behind her back. She struggled, but she was exhausted. They were dragged onto the boat. 2 hours later, Grace was thrown into a chair in a lavish, marble-floored room. They were in a private villa on the coast. Alexander Blackwood sat behind a glass desk. He was a man in his 50s, with silver hair and a smile that didn't reach his shark-like eyes. Professor Sterling stood next to him, looking smug. Zayn was tied to a chair next to Grace, his face bruised. Tariq stood by the door. "The waitress," Blackwood said, swirling a glass of scotch. "Professor Sterling tells me you made a fool of him in New York." "He did that himself," Grace spat. Sterling flushed. "She's a fraud, Alexander. She's just repeating things she memorized." "Is she?" Blackwood stood up and walked over to Grace. He leaned down, smelling her hair. She recoiled. "You solved the Salt Cave riddle. You found the deed. Unfortunately for Zayn, we have the deed now. We burned it 5 minutes ago." Zayn let out a sound of pure anguish. "However," Blackwood continued, "there is the matter of the flash drive. It's encrypted, AES 256, but it has a linguistic failsafe, a passphrase based on the Al-Rashid lineage. If we enter the wrong phrase 3 times, the data wipes, and that data contains the coordinates of every unmapped oil reserve in the region." He placed the laptop in front of Grace. "Unlock it," Blackwood ordered. "Go to hell," Grace said. Blackwood nodded to Tariq. Tariq stepped forward and pistol-whipped Zayn across the jaw. Blood splattered on the white floor. "Stop!" Grace screamed. "Unlock it," Blackwood repeated calmly, "or the next one breaks his kneecap." Grace looked at Zane. He was groggy, barely conscious. She looked at the laptop. She knew the code. It was in the journal, hidden in the decorative border of page 10. The roots of the palm drink deep. But she also knew something about Blackwood's system. She saw the server lights blinking in the corner of the room. They were connected to the main Blackwood network to upload the data instantly. She looked at Sterling. "I'll do it, but I need to focus. Tell the professor to stop breathing so loud." Sterling huffed, but stepped back. Grace typed. She didn't type the password. She typed a command string she had learned from a hacker ex-boyfriend in Berlin. It was a logic bomb, a script that looks like a password, but when processed by the decryption software, forces the system to consume all its own memory until it crashes. She hit enter. "Accessing," the screen read. Then, the lights in the villa flickered. "What did you do?" Blackwood demanded. "I translated it," Grace said, a cold smile forming, "into a language your server understands. It's called self-destruct." Sparks showered from the server rack in the corner. The alarm system went haywire. The electronic locks on the doors clicked open as the system rebooted. "She crashed the security grid," Tariq yelled. "Kill them!" Blackwood roared. Grace didn't wait. She kicked the chair backward, slamming it into the shins of the guard behind her. As he doubled over, she grabbed the knife from his belt. She slashed his wrist, freeing her hands. Zane, seeing the opening, threw his body weight against Tariq, knocking the traitor to the ground. Grace grabbed the guard's gun. She fired 2 shots, one into the ceiling to create chaos, and one into the leg of the guard approaching Zane. "Zane, move!" They scrambled toward the now open terrace doors. They were on the 2nd floor. Below was a swimming pool. "Jump!" Grace commanded. They leaped over the railing, just as bullets shattered the glass doors behind them. They hit the water hard. The water of the infinity pool was freezing, a violent shock to their systems after the adrenaline of the villa. Grace surfaced first, gasping for air, her lungs burning. The water around them erupted in tiny, violent geysers as bullets from the balcony above slapped the surface. "Stay under!" she screamed, though the sound was garbled by the chaos. She grabbed Zane by the collar of his ruined cashmere sweater and dragged him toward the pool's edge, the side obscured by a decorative waterfall. They hauled themselves onto the wet stone, shivering uncontrollably. Grace's tactical pants were heavy with water, and her boots felt like lead weights. "Can you run?" Grace asked, wiping wet hair from her eyes. She checked the stolen pistol. 1 round in the chamber. The magazine was gone, lost in the swim. Zane coughed up water, clutching his bruised ribs. He looked at her, his dark eyes fierce despite the exhaustion. If the alternative is dying in Alexander Blackwood's swimming pool, then yes, I can run. "The garage?" Grace hissed, pointing to a detached structure 50 yards away, across a manicured lawn. "It's our only shot." They didn't sprint. They moved in a low crouch, using the shadows of the hedges. The villa's alarm system was still rebooting, causing the floodlights to strobe erratically. It was a chaotic disco of danger. They reached the side door of the garage just as a shout went up from the patio. "They're in the garden. Seal the perimeter." Grace kicked the door latch. Locked. She looked at the glass pane, wrapped her elbow in her wet sleeve, and smashed it. She reached through, unlocked it, and they tumbled inside. The garage was a shrine to automotive excess. It smelled of oil, rubber, and expensive leather. Blackwood collected cars like he collected secrets. There was a Ferrari, a McLaren, and a vintage Jaguar. "Keys," Grace breathed, scanning the room. "Please tell me this guy is arrogant enough to leave keys." "He is," Zane said, stumbling toward a silver shape in the corner. But not in the supercars. Those have trackers. We need something analog, something brutal. He ripped the cover off a vintage Aston Martin V8 Vantage. It was a muscle car disguised as a gentleman's tourer, and sure enough, the keys were dangling in the ignition. "Get in," Zane ordered, sliding into the driver's seat. Grace barely got the passenger door closed when the garage's main roller door began to rattle. Someone was trying to pry it open from the outside. Zane turned the key. The engine roared to life with a guttural growl that shook the tools on the walls. He didn't wait for the door to open. He threw the gear stick into reverse. "Hold on!" Zane slammed on the gas. The car shot backward, smashing through the heavy wooden garage doors in a shower of splinters and twisted metal. They flew out into the driveway, the rear bumper clipping a mercenary who had been trying to breach the entrance. Zane spun the wheel, drifting the heavy car 180 degrees, tires screaming against the cobblestones. Bullets sparked off the rear chassis, pinging loudly against the metal. "Head down!" Grace yelled, pushing Zane's head lower as the rear windshield shattered, showering the back seat in glass diamonds. They tore out of the compound gates, the engine screaming as Zane redlined the gears. They hit the coastal highway, the lights of Amen glowing in the distance like a mirage. "We made it," Zane exhaled, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Not yet," Grace said, looking in the side mirror. "We have company." 2 black SUVs were tearing down the road behind them, their high beams blinding. A man was leaning out of the sunroof of the lead vehicle, holding an automatic weapon. "They're going to run us off the road," Grace shouted. "We can't outrun them on the straightaway. This car is heavy." "I don't intend to outrun them," Zane gritted out. "I intend to outdrive them." He swerved violently into the oncoming lane, dodging a civilian truck. The SUV behind them tried to follow, but overcorrected, clipping the median. It didn't stop, but it fell back. "Where are we going?" Grace yelled over the roar of the wind rushing through the broken windows. "The airport is locked down by now." "The U.S. Embassy!" Zane shouted back. "It's in the Abdoun district, 5 miles." "Zane, listen to me." Grace looked at him, her face pale in the dashboard lights. "Even if we make it, we lost the drive. Blackwood has the laptop. He has the coordinates. We failed." Zane glanced at her, a strange manic grin breaking through the blood and bruises on his face. "Grace, for a genius, you are very trusting." "What?" "The flash drive in the laptop," Zane yelled, swerving again to avoid gunfire. "It was a decoy. I swapped them in the cave while you were setting up the climbing rope." Grace stared at him. "You swapped them? Where is the real one?" Zane tapped his stomach. "Safe and sound. You swallowed it." Grace's jaw dropped. "You swallowed a jagged piece of plastic containing $1 billion secret?" "It's a micro SD card." Zane laughed, a sound bordering on hysteria. "Digesting it will be unpleasant, but losing my company would be worse." Grace shook her head, a laugh bubbling up in her throat despite the terror. "You are insane. You know that, right?" "I prefer determined." Crash. The lead SUV slammed into their rear bumper. The Aston Martin shuddered violently. They were losing speed. The heavy steel of the vintage car protected them, but the physics were against them. "They're trying to spin us!" Grace yelled. She checked the pistol again. "One shot. I have to make it count." She unbuckled her seatbelt. "What are you doing?" Zane screamed. "Keep it steady." Grace climbed halfway out the window, the wind whipping her wet hair into a frenzy. She leveled the pistol at the SUV's front tire. It was a near impossible shot at 80 miles an hour. She breathed out. "The hawk sleeps." She squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck the front passenger tire of the SUV. The tire blew out with a sound like a cannon shot. The SUV lurched violently to the right, flipped onto its side, and skidded across the asphalt in a shower of sparks, blocking the second vehicle behind it. Grace pulled herself back inside, collapsing into the seat. "Got 'em." "Remind me to give you a raise," Zane breathed. "Focus." Grace pointed ahead. "Look." They were entering the city limits, but the road ahead was blocked. Two massive sanitation trucks were parked sideways across the 4-lane highway, completely closing off the route. Men with rifles were standing behind them. "It's a kill zone," Grace said, her voice dropping. "They knew we were coming." Zane slammed on the brakes, the car fishtailing as they slowed. "We can't stop. If we stop, they swarm us. We can't go through a garbage truck, Zane." Grace scanned the surroundings. To the left was a concrete wall. To the right, a construction site for a new overpass. There was a mound of packed earth, a temporary ramp leading up to the unfinished bridge section. "The ramp," Grace said. Zane looked at it. It was steep. The gap between the ramp and the road on the other side of the blockade was at least 20 feet. "This isn't a movie, Grace," Zane shouted. "The suspension will snap. The axle will break. The alternative is a firing squad." Grace grabbed the wheel. "Do it!" Zane looked at her. He looked at the blockade. He shifted down a gear, the engine screaming in protest. "Hold on to something!" he roared. He floored the accelerator. The Aston Martin surged forward, eating up the distance. The mercenaries at the blockade realized too late what was happening. They raised their weapons, but the silver bullet was moving too fast. They hit the dirt ramp at 95 miles per hour. For a terrifying, silent second, gravity suspended. The heavy car soared through the air, sailing over the blockade, over the heads of the stunned gunmen. Grace saw the city lights spinning. She saw the moon. She saw her life flash before her eyes. The dusty safe house, the hotel ballroom, the caves. Slam. The car impacted the asphalt on the other side. The sound was sickening. Metal crunching, glass shattering. The front suspension collapsed instantly. The car bounced, bottomed out, sparks flying in a 10-foot curtain behind them. They spun out of control, sliding sideways for 100 yards before coming to a smoking halt. Grace groaned, her head resting on the dashboard. "Is everyone alive?" Zane coughed, blood trickling from his nose. "I think the car is dead." "The embassy," Grace whispered. "Look." They had crashed 50 yards from the main gates of the U.S. Embassy. Bright spotlights instantly pinned them. "Driver, exit the vehicle. Hands where I can see them." A voice amplified by a megaphone boomed from the guard towers. Red laser dots danced on the windshield. Zane tried to open his door. It was jammed. He kicked it open with his remaining strength and fell out onto the pavement. Grace stumbled out the passenger side. Her legs gave way and she fell to her knees. Behind them, the second SUV from the chase, the one that had been blocked, was pulling up. 4 men in tactical gear jumped out. They raised their weapons. "Get down!" Grace screamed at Zane. But the men didn't shoot. They couldn't. Not here. Not in front of 50 U.S. Marines watching from the walls. It was a Mexican standoff. Blackwood's men stood 20 yards away, weapons raised but hesitant. The Marines on the wall had their rifles trained on everyone. "Drop your weapons," the Marine sergeant commanded the mercenaries. The mercenaries looked at each other. They knew if they fired a shot, the Marines would obliterate them. Zane stood up. He was swaying. His expensive suit was shredded. His face was a mask of blood and dirt. But he stood tall. He reached into his inner pocket. "Freeze!" the Marines shouted. "Do not reach." Zane moved slowly. He pulled out a blue diplomatic passport and held it high above his head. "I am Sheikh Zaineh al-Rashid," he bellowed, his voice cracking but carrying the undeniable weight of authority. "I am a foreign dignitary. This woman is an American citizen. We are requesting immediate political asylum under the Geneva Convention." He pointed a shaking finger at the mercenaries. "And those men are unlawful combatants attempting to assassinate a head of state." The Marine sergeant paused. He looked at the passport. He looked at the mercenaries, who were slowly lowering their guns, realizing the game was over. "Open the gate," the sergeant ordered. "Marine squad, move out! Secure the package!" The heavy steel gates of the embassy groaned open. A squad of Marines in full combat gear rushed out, forming a protective phalanx around Grace and Zane. Grace felt strong hands grab her arms, lifting her up. She looked back. The mercenaries were retreating, jumping back into their SUV and peeling away into the night. They were safe. Zane looked at her over the shoulder of a Marine. He spat a tooth onto the pavement and grinned, a bloody, beautiful grin. "I told you," he wheezed. "I have full dental." Grace laughed, and then the darkness took her. 3 weeks later, the air in The Hague was crisp and smelled of rain. It was a stark contrast to the heat of the desert. The International Court of Justice was a fortress of glass and steel. Inside, the proceedings had been swift and brutal. The memory card, which Zane had retrieved 2 days after the incident, contained everything: emails, bank transfers, assassination orders. Alexander Blackwood was looking at life in a supermax prison. The Al Rashid Company was returned to its rightful owner. Grace stood near the back of the courtroom, hidden in the shadows. She wore a simple navy trench coat. Her arm was in a sling, and a small bandage covered the cut on her cheek. She watched as Zane walked out of the double doors. He was surrounded by reporters, cameras flashing like lightning. He looked impeccable in a fresh 3-piece suit. The bruising on his face faded to faint yellow shadows. He answered questions with the smooth charm of a billionaire, but his eyes were scanning the crowd. He saw her. He stopped mid-sentence, ignoring a question from CNN, and walked straight toward her. The crowd parted. "You didn't come to the victory party," Zane said, stopping a foot away from her. "I'm not big on parties," Grace said, clutching her purse. "Too many people, too much noise." "I have something for you," Zane said. He pulled a check from his pocket. "The 1 million, as promised." Grace took it. Her hands were steady. "Thank you." "And," Zane continued, his voice dropping lower, "I have a job offer, head of global intelligence for Al Rashid Industries, based in London. No uniform, no name tag, just you, solving problems." Grace looked at the check. It was freedom. It was her grandmother's health. It was everything she thought she wanted. "I can't," Grace said softly. Zane blinked, surprised. "Why? The pay is triple this check." "Because," Grace looked up at him, her eyes clear. "You don't need a waitress anymore, Zane. You need a partner, and I need to figure out who I am when I'm not running for my life." Zane studied her for a long moment. Then he smiled. It wasn't the smile of a sheikh or a tycoon. It was the smile of the man who had climbed a salt rope with her. "Then take the check," Zane said. "Go find out, but keep your phone on. I have a feeling I'm going to get into trouble again." "I'm counting on it," Grace smirked. She turned and walked away, down the steps of the courthouse, into the grey afternoon. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was Grace Bennett, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't hiding. She was just beginning. And that is the breathtaking conclusion of Grace Bennett's story, from an invisible waitress in a hotel ballroom to the savior of a dynasty. It reminds us that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision that something else is more important than fear. Grace risked everything, not for the money, but for the truth. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button hard. It really supports the channel. Share this video with a friend who needs a reminder that they are capable of more than they think. And if you haven't already, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next story. What do you think Grace will do next? Will she return to Zane? Let me know your theories in the comments. Thanks for watching.